Today, we're looking at celebrity warning signs that, in hindsight, were hiding in plain sight. Dan Schneider's foot obsession. For years, Nickelodeon shows associated with Dan Schneider featured recurring jokes involving feet, including repeated close-ups of children's feet. At the time, viewers also recalled Schneider approaching children with dollar bills and asking to photograph their feet. In 2024, the documentary series Quiet on Set brought renewed attention to the environments surrounding Schneider's productions and the creative choices that had previously been dismissed as jokes. Schneider has denied sexual intent, but looking back, those repeated foot-related moments have been described by many as early warning signs. Vince McMahon's controversial storylines. WWE has always relied on shock, drama, and controversy, but some of Vince McMahon's storylines now look very different in hindsight. During the early 2000s, McMahon frequently appeared in storylines involving female performers, where he was portrayed as a powerful boss who flirted with, coerced, or humiliated employees. At the time, these segments were presented as outrageous entertainment, but some of the storylines involved themes of power and sexual exploitation that later became particularly uncomfortable to revisit. Years later, allegations of misconduct and claims involving hush money payments emerged publicly. That doesn't mean every fictional storyline predicted real events, but it does explain why some of those old segments now attract far more scrutiny than they did at the time. Marilyn Manson's comments about control. Marilyn Manson's public persona was built around shock and controversy. But long before serious allegations were made against him, Manson gave interviews in which he openly discussed domination, control, jealousy, and emotional power in relationships. In a 2009 interview with Spin, he spoke about wanting to break partners and portrayed obsessive behavior as part of his romantic persona. At the time, comments like these could easily be dismissed as part of his provocative rock star image. But later, former partners made allegations of emotional and physical abuse. Manson has denied allegations of abuse. Still, when people look back at his old interviews today, those comments are often viewed as warning signs that were visible long before the allegations became widely known. James Corden and complaints from restaurant staff. James Corden became famous for his friendly, cheerful television personality. But over the years, stories about his behavior toward hospitality workers began circulating. In 2022, the owner of New York's Balthazar restaurant publicly accused Corden of behaving badly toward staff. Corden later discussed the incident publicly and apologized. What made the controversy stood out was the contrast between his warm public image and the complaints describing him as rude or dismissive toward restaurant employees. The incident eventually became part of a larger conversation about how celebrities treat service workers when the cameras aren't necessarily watching. And that's an important lesson. Sometimes the way someone treats people who have less power can reveal more than their carefully crafted public image. Gary Glitter's connection to youth culture. Looking back at Gary Glitter's image today is deeply unsettling. The glam rock star built much of his public persona around youthful rebellion, energetic partying, and a connection with teenage audiences. During the 1970s, this type of youth-focused image was common in rock music. But Glitter's unusually close association with underage fans and his continued efforts to remain connected to youth-oriented culture stand out very differently today. Later, his criminal conviction for offenses involving minors and possession of illegal material completely changed how his earlier image was viewed. The colorful costumes, glam rock performances, and youthful branding suddenly looked much darker in hindsight. What once appeared to be a rebellious rock star persona became something far more disturbing. Russell Brand's constant sexual comments. Russell Brand built much of his early comedy persona around sexuality, relationships, and openly discussing his promiscuous lifestyle. His interviews, radio appearances, and stand-up routines were filled with sexual jokes and provocative comments. At the time, many audiences considered this part of his eccentric and deliberately outrageous personality. Brand himself often described his past relationships as consensual and said he was open about his behavior. But over time, some of his comments became more uncomfortable to revisit. Multiple women later accused Brand of serious misconduct, allegations he has denied. He was subsequently charged in relation to allegations involving 4 women. For many people, the issue isn't simply that he made provocative jokes. It's that his constant willingness to push sexual boundaries had become such a familiar part of his persona that people often stopped questioning where the line actually was. Jimmy Savile and his claims about access. Jimmy Savile was famous for his television career and charity work. But one strange part of his public persona was his repeated joking about having unusual access to places most ordinary people couldn't enter. He talked about having keys and being able to go into hospitals, charities, and other secure institutions where he worked or volunteered. At the time, those comments were often treated as eccentric jokes. Savile even made provocative remarks about his access to young people and institutions. After his death, investigations revealed decades of sexual abuse, including abuse connected to places he had access to. Suddenly, those old jokes about keys and unrestricted access sounded completely different. What audiences once interpreted as eccentricity became deeply disturbing in hindsight. Diddy's party talk. Sean Diddy Combs became famous for throwing extravagant parties. Over the years, he openly talked about his reputation for huge celebrations and wild nightlife. In interviews, he sometimes joked about his parties being so extreme that authorities might shut them down. At the time, audiences largely viewed these comments as celebrity bravado. The parties were part of his larger public image: wealth, fame, music, luxury, and excess. But following a wave of lawsuits and serious allegations, many connected in the public conversation to his parties, those old comments began receiving much more scrutiny. Statements that once sounded like harmless jokes started being viewed by some people as possible warning signs. The important point is that hindsight can dramatically change how we interpret something that once seemed completely ordinary. R. Kelly's Pied Piper persona. R. Kelly adopted the nickname the Pied Piper of R&B during his career. The name referenced the famous folklore character who used music to lure children away. Kelly presented the nickname as a metaphor for his influence as a musician. But considering the allegations that surrounded him over the years, especially allegations involving minors, the nickname became deeply uncomfortable in hindsight. He continued using the persona in songs, performances, and videos. Eventually, investigations and criminal convictions revealed extensive abuse. That transformed what had once been presented as a playful nickname into something that many people now view as an obvious warning sign that was sitting in plain sight. Bill Cosby's jokes about drugs. And at number 1 is Bill Cosby. Before numerous women came forward with allegations against him, Cosby had publicly made jokes about substances being added to drinks. In a 1991 Larry King Live interview, he joked about Spanish fly and its supposed effect on women. Even The Cosby Show featured an episode involving a barbecue sauce that was supposedly capable of making people more amorous. At the time, these moments were treated as comedy. Cosby was widely known as America's wholesome television dad, so audiences often interpreted his jokes through that image. But after dozens of women came forward with allegations of sexual assault, those old jokes took on an entirely different meaning. What once sounded like provocative humor suddenly appeared, in hindsight, to be a disturbing warning sign. And that's what makes these stories so unsettling. Sometimes the clues aren't hidden. They're right there in interviews, jokes, performances, and public behavior. The difficult part is recognizing what they mean before something more serious happens. Which of these warning signs do you think was the most obvious in hindsight? Let us know in the comments.